So what I want to talk about today, I'm just going to talk about kind of what kind of analytical leverage we can get from thinking about the local. And I'm going to talk about some approaches to analyzing the local within sociology. So the study of space and place and locale have had a very long tradition within sociology. And I don't have time today to talk about its evolution and its history. But I do want to discuss the local as it relates to the study of race, ethnicity, and group boundaries, since those are my interests. And my interest in the local really stems from research questions that I have regarding how local contexts, and I'll refer to local contexts as geographic entities, such as neighborhoods, communities, and areas of interaction, so how these local contexts shape individual and group action. So what analytical leverage do we gain by thinking about local contexts? And I want to just start with an example from some seminal work from William Julius Wilson that probably many of you are familiar with. He published a book in 1987 called The Truly Disadvantaged, which tried to explain the rise of persistent poverty in urban neighborhoods among racial minorities, mostly African Americans. He noted that in 1959, less than 1/3 of the poverty population in the US lived in central cities, but by the early 1990s, close to half of the nation's poor were located in central cities. So he wanted to try to explain this shift. A large part of his argument was that economic restructuring in the United States, so the move from a manufacturing economy to a service-based economy, had a clear negative effect on urban inner-city communities, mostly because of the lack of jobs. And it left poor blacks and poor minorities without the capital, normative structures, and other infrastructure to facilitate organized communities. Doug Massey and Nancy Denton in the 1990s turned around and wanted to engage with William Julius Wilson. And they argue that it wasn't just this broader shift in the economy that led to the deterioration of inner city communities in the United States, but it had much to do with the local contexts, the ways in which local contexts were organized in regards to race. And so for them, the most important social factor that led to the decline of these inner city communities was residential segregation. And they found that residential segregation between blacks and whites, when it was relatively low, blacks and whites were exposed to similar levels of poverty, so poverty at equal rates. But when residential segregation between blacks and whites increased, when it was relatively high, blacks were exposed to higher levels of poverty because on average, blacks had higher levels of poverty than whites. And blacks were concentrated in fewer neighborhoods since they're segregated. In turn, whites were exposed to lower levels of poverty. And we can talk about kind of how do they figure this out, what kind of data that they use if people are interested later. But the point is that without understanding the structuring of the local context, again, how neighborhoods were structured in regards to race, we wouldn't have come to the understanding about how and why patterns of residential segregation had devastating consequences for blacks. And historically, segregation has been clearly something that has led to the decline of opportunities and life chances for African Americans. So what should you take from this? Basically, Wilson's focus on this broad social forces such as economic restructuring really didn't tell the whole story. Other accounts have also focused on individual explanations or motivations about, why individuals use welfare programs, why they remain unemployed. But again, looking at either place, at the macro or at the micro, really provide partial explanations for what's going on. And so I'm advocating for something in the middle, what sociologists refer to as the mesolevel or the local. And local can be defined in a number of ways, but again, I'm thinking about local as communities, neighborhoods, areas of interaction that affect opportunities and the life chances of groups, and I'm interested in immigrant and racial groups, and how these communities and neighborhoods might shape their capacity for things like collective action, civic engagement, etc. And so basically there have been three approaches to analyzing, well, at least three, I'm sure there are more, approaches to analyzing local context, or another way to think about it is that there are three methodological approaches within sociology. And I'm just going to briefly talk about them, and then I'm going to talk about just an example from my work, and then maybe how we can think about moving forward. So the three methodological approaches, first, and the one that I'm most familiar with, are quantitative studies that typically use survey data to try to examine the effects of local contexts on individual and group outcomes. So looking at, for example, characteristics of neighborhoods or other sorts of areas, larger communities, metropolitan areas, how these characteristics affect things like crime, health, civic engagement, and a host of other social phenomena. And then there are observational case studies, interviews, observations, that basically identify the processes that occur within these local contexts. These studies often provide vivid details of the contexts themselves, which many quantitative studies are unable to do. They also are able to get at the perceptions and strategies that individuals use within these contexts when they're navigating local institutions, when they're interacting with people from other social groups, etc. And then there are experimental and quasi-experimental studies. These are less common, partially, I think, because they can be quite expensive. But these studies explore, again, how living in different neighborhoods that look different from one another or have different characteristics might have different outcomes for individuals. So, for example, the random assignment of neighborhoods to receive certain sorts of treatments, such as maybe an AIDS intervention or community policing, and then we can compare treatment and control groups. And I can talk about studies that have done this if people are interested in it. So again, I think I'm talking quite a bit. So briefly, I'll just say that my research reflects a first approach. I use quantitative methods to think about how local contexts shape immigrant organizing efforts, the formation of a collective identity. And for a series of papers that I'm working on, I'm really interested in understanding how the structuring, composition, and dynamics of local contexts affected whether immigrants engaged in protests and civic activities, but I'll talk about the protests, related to a whole host of topics such as bilingual education, deportation, amnesty, unfair labor practices, and school policies. And in one particular paper, I was interested in whether segregation and threats, so conditions that heighten group boundaries between immigrants and natives, could be important in helping to generate a collective minority status based on race, ethnicity, citizenship, and or language among immigrants. So again, what conditions really heighten these boundaries between immigrants and natives? And do they have any effect, or are they associated with rates of protest within different locations? And so I used data on immigrant protests across 52 metropolitan areas in the United States, and I did find support for this idea. So when immigrants and natives are segregated within neighborhoods and labor markets, when there are instances of anti-immigrant activity within particular locales, this actually leads to higher rates or instances of immigrant protest. I recognize that I'm kind of going over this quite quickly, and I may be, there may be more details that people are interested in, but basically my point is that, I guess I should say the other thing is that I also looked at state level variables, not just variables associated with metropolitan areas, to see also which ones were more predictive of these immigrant protests. And I find that the local level variables are actually more important. So I guess my point is to, give you all a sense of how I'm thinking about the local, how I'm conceptualizing the local. And in terms of moving ahead, again, studying race, ethnicity, immigration, group boundaries, I do think that it would be useful for us to, again, move beyond macro level explanations, to move beyond thinking about just individual motivations or characteristics for explaining behavior, but thinking more about this local meso level. And I do think that what would also be useful is for sociology, and I think it's moving in this direction, to use more of a mixed methods approach. So the problem with the approach that I'm using, I'm getting a lot of statistical power. I can look at 52 different areas. I can look at variation across these 52 different areas. I can associate certain characteristics of these areas with the outcomes that I'm interested in. But what I really miss is kind of the details, the dynamics, the interactions that are occurring within these areas, right? And so I think that mixed methods, meaning merging quantitative and qualitative interviews, observations, and regression analyses would be really useful. And I feel like this is something that has definitely been developing within sociology. I don't think it's quite accepted. I think that it's hard to get it published. But it's something that I think that the field should be moving in this direction.